Number 16. The legal shock. The river at Sedan should have been the wall. Instead, on May 13, 1940, French officers looked across at smoke, sirens, and a sky that seemed to be falling. German dive bombers hit the gun lines, the command posts, the bridges, the nerves. Men reported tanks that were not yet there. A rumor moved faster than armor. German panzers were already at Bulge. They were not. The panic still cracked a division. By the time pontoon bridges went in, this was no longer just a river crossing. It was collapse. Within days, the armored spearhead tore west, reached the Channel, and trapped Allied armies that had marched north expecting the main blow somewhere else. Here, the legal shock starts. The technique that looked like an outlaw weapon was never itself prosecuted as a war crime. Some commanders became legends for it. Others were later condemned for tactics that looked disturbingly close. On May 10, 1940, Germany attacked the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France at once. To the people watching, this was not a normal campaign fought at high speed. Front lines stopped meaning what they were supposed to mean. Tanks drove at the point. Aircraft worked overhead. Radios tied the movement together. Columns pushed deep before defenders understood where the main blow had landed. France did not just lose ground. In weeks, a major European power seemed to come apart under a method so sudden and so violent that later generations treated its name almost like a prohibited weapon. The reality was stranger. The Allied High Command expected the main German attack in Belgium, so it moved its best armies north to meet it. That was not irrational. Belgium had been the classic invasion route before, but while Allied attention locked in that direction, General Geert von Rundstedt's Army Group A pushed through the Ardennes with about 45 divisions against only about 18 French divisions opposite the central sector. Inside that thrust were 7 panzer divisions grouped in 3 corps under Guderian, Reinhardt, and Schmidt. The route looked wrong for mass armor. Narrow roads, bad surfaces, forest, bottlenecks. That was exactly why the French treated it as a poor place for the decisive blow. For a moment, the whole operation looked less like genius than a traffic jam. German convoys clogged the Ardennes so badly that the line of vehicles stretched from the Rhine toward the Meuse. If Allied air power had found that mass and hit it effectively, the legend might have died in the trees before it reached the river. Instead, by May 13th, Heinz Guderian's corps reached Sedan. The crossing began at 1600. It should have been costly. Guderian had about 150 artillery pieces facing roughly 350 French guns. The balance had to shift somewhere else, and it shifted into the air. Panzergruppe Kleist received support from almost 1,500 German aircraft, with the heaviest concentration near Sedan. French positions were not erased from the map. They were battered, isolated, deafened, and unnerved. Later, people called it vertical artillery. The phrase fits. The aircraft were not replacing tanks. They were providing the preparation the German guns alone could not. That is the legal hinge. The tactic blamed for collapsing a nation was not, in legal terms, a banned method. Speed was not illegal. Surprise was not illegal. Breaking through a weak point, coordinating armor with aircraft, exploiting confusion, driving deep into the rear. None of that by itself violated the laws of war. The most revealing detail is the timing of the panic. On the evening of May 13th, word spread that German armor had already reached Bulge. The tanks had not yet crossed the Meuse. The first German tank crossed about 12 hours later. The false report arrived first. In that gap, the French 55th Infantry Division began to dissolve under pressure that was partly physical and partly psychological. Blitzkrieg built its reputation on steel. At Sedan, one of its sharpest weapons was timing. By the afternoon of May 14th, about 570 German tanks had crossed to the West Bank over pontoon bridges. The Allies tried to smash those bridges from the air. They sent about 400 aircraft. Nearly 100 were lost against 303 German anti-aircraft guns, and the bridges stayed up. The spearhead kept moving. West, hard, toward the Channel. By May 20th and 21st, the armored advance had reached the coast and cut off Allied armies in Belgium. France had not formally signed defeat. Operationally, reversing it had become extraordinarily difficult. Why was this never banned as a tactic when entire countries saw it as war stripped of restraint? Because the law did not ban operational brilliance. It banned specific acts: killing prisoners, firing on surrender, misusing protected symbols, attacking civilians as civilians. Terror and massacre can follow a breakthrough, but they are not the breakthrough itself. The method at Sedan was ruthless, concentrated, and catastrophic. But no post-war tribunal treated rapid armored penetration with close air support as the charge. Courts and later war crimes cases pursued what followed elsewhere: occupation policy, prisoner treatment, attacks on non-combatants. Officially, blitzkrieg remained a military method. The crimes attached to it were prosecuted under other names. Number 15. Bodies as ammunition. Second comes the tactic where the weapon is not a machine, but the number of men a commander is willing to lose. Start with the ratio. In the Red Army, penal troops were only 7 to 8% of the field army. In combat, they suffered losses 3 to 6 times higher than regular units. This was not rumor or movie imagery. It was a staffing formula that ended in blood. When men are pushed forward in waves because they are considered expendable, does that become a war crime? Or is it still command? On July 28, 1942, after disaster on the Southern Front, Stalin signed Order Number 227. No step back. Retreat was no longer just failure. It became an offense to be repaid at the line itself. The order authorized penal battalions of up to 800 men and penal companies of 150 to 200. In August and September 1942 alone, in the Don Bend, Soviet records identify 6 penal battalions and more than 30 penal companies formed and sent into battle. This was not one commander snapping under pressure. It was organized. The numbers get colder the closer you look. Across the war, 427,910 people passed through Soviet penal units. They were not used only to run at machine guns until they vanished. The system was broader than that and harsher. They were sent to the hardest sectors: assault groups, reconnaissance, prisoner snatch missions, mine clearing. That means structure, paperwork, intent. One of the few named men who later described this system from the inside was Alexander V. Pilchin. He served in an officers' penal battalion in 1944 and 1945, and later became a company commander there. His memoir does not give you a constant screaming mob. It gives you a mechanism. Men degraded by the state, sent to places where survival itself counted as redemption. You move forward because there is enemy fire in front of you and punishment behind you. In that setup, the wave is not just bodies, it is coercion, with rifles issued. But the arithmetic does not settle the legal part. Armies are allowed to order assaults likely to kill their own men. They do it in every war. They can make terrible decisions without crossing into a prosecutable category. The boundary is not simply casualty count. If it were, half of 20th century command would be in the dock. Now shift oceans. At about 04:45 on July 7, 1944, on Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito sent what remained of his force into a final attack against the U.S. 105th Infantry Regiment. The battle for the island had already run from June 15th to July 9th. Around 71,000 U.S. troops had been committed. By this point, the Japanese line in the north was collapsing. Before dawn, officers with swords led thousands through a gap between the 105th's battalions. By evening, the charge had failed. The Japanese dead from that attack alone reached 4,311. In the 105th Infantry, 406 Americans were killed and 512 wounded. These were not abstract totals spread across a campaign. They were the footprint of one concentrated impact. Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien was killed there. Private Thomas Baker was left behind, wounded with a pistol. Captain Benjamin Solomon died at an aid station fighting off the attackers. His Medal of Honor would not come until 2002. This is the image most people mean when they say human wave. A mass charge, shouting men, bayonets, swords, bodies piling up in front of automatic weapons. On Saipan, that image is real enough. But even here, The label hides a difference. Saito's attack was a final offensive act by a trapped army, shaped by imperial doctrine, battlefield collapse, and the refusal of surrender. The Soviet penal assault was something else. It was a repeatable state method for spending disgraced troops in high-risk tasks while offering survival as repayment. The casualty logic looks similar. The command logic does not. That matters if we return to the question at the start. Neither tactic was automatically illegal just because it was horrific. International law in the Second World War did not ban frontal assaults, suicidal charges, or commanders choosing missions with terrible odds. It did not set a casualty percentage beyond which an order became criminal by itself. No tribunal had a simple category called sending too many of your own men to die. Still, these episodes brush against something people instinctively read as forbidden. They show command systems treating their own soldiers less as protected personnel than as consumable force. Yet even that was usually not enough for a war crimes charge unless another rule was crossed. Killing prisoners, denying surrender, targeting civilians, misusing medical protection, executing men without trial. Expendability is not the same as illegality, even when the distance between them feels microscopic. The comparison is brutal in its simplicity. On Saipan, the Japanese final charge was militarily desperate and catastrophically wasteful. But it was not prosecuted as a distinct war crime because it was an attack on armed enemy troops. Soviet penal assaults, the state deliberately fed condemned or disgraced men into extreme risk missions under coercive discipline. But that too sits mostly under command practice rather than a standalone banned tactic. One system sacrificed men to break a line. The other sacrificed men to erase disgrace. Legally, both could remain inside the frame. By evening, the field north of the 105th was still covered with bodies. Elsewhere, men in penal companies kept walking into minefields. Number 14. The hidden shot. On December 18, 1944, near Awil, Belgium, a military policeman waved down a jeep that looked exactly right. American shape, American markings. 3 men inside in American uniforms. For a few seconds, it was just another vehicle on another winter road in the Ardennes. Then came the questions. A password challenge. A hesitation. Within minutes, the stop on the roadside had become far more than a routine check. The men were Manfred Pernas, Gunther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt, Germans from Otto Skorzeni's Special Ardennes Force. They had crossed the front near Stoumont about 30 minutes earlier. That tells you how thin the line was between front and rear in December 1944. Half an hour after slipping through, they were already in the zone where trust carried most of the load. Roads, signs, traffic control. Directions passed from one uniformed man to another. Inside the Jeep was a kit built for deception. 3 USM 1911 pistols, 2 portable radios, 2 German 9mm submachine guns, 1 Walther P38, 6 German egg grenades. Papers good enough to work until somebody started talking. Their mission was not the usual kind of ambush. All through the war, soldiers hid in cover, waited, struck, and vanished. Infantry did it, commandos did it, partisans did it. Concealment was ordinary. That was not the forbidden part. The distinction began at the moment trust entered the scene. Picture the road, the hedgerow, the shot from nowhere. The instinctive reaction is simple: ambush, treachery, murder from cover. The law split it more carefully. A soldier hidden in brush was one thing. A fighter who became dangerous by pretending to be someone the target was supposed to trust was another. That roadside stop in Belgium mattered because of what the Jeep represented. In October 1944, Hitler had ordered Skorzeny to build a special force for the Ardennes offensive. Panzer Brigade 150 was meant to move behind American lines in captured vehicles and U.S. uniforms. Its job was to redirect traffic, gather intelligence, sabotage communications, and spread panic before German armor reached weak points. Pernas later estimated there were about 150 English-speaking men in the brigade. Not enough to remake the battlefield, enough to contaminate it. Once one Jeep team was caught, suspicion spread through the Allied rear. Every signpost could be wrong, every traffic cop could be fake, Every driver with the right helmet and the right accent became a problem. Interrogation exposed the wider operation, and rumor outran any armored column. Checkpoints multiplied. Real Americans were stopped and questioned on baseball, state capitals, slang, anything that might prove they were who they claimed to be. The damage came from that spread of distrust, not from bullets fired from a ditch, not from some spectacular firefight. A single idea was enough. The next friendly face might only be wearing friendship. The legal line broke in a way an ordinary ambush did not. The same attack by the same roadside could fall on opposite sides of the law because of one hidden fact: what the shooter was pretending to be when he fired. On December 21st, the 3 captured men were tried by a U.S. military commission. Days later, on December 23, 1944, they were executed by firing squad at Henri-Chapelle. The wartime judgment was direct and harsh. Men in enemy uniform, behind the line, armed, carrying radios, grenades, and forged identity papers, had crossed from ruse into criminality. Occupied Europe had already shown what happened when disguise, sabotage, and alleged partisan attacks blurred together. Occupation forces regularly used such attacks, or claimed them, to justify reprisals against villages. Rear area deception was never just a trick. It could set off punishment far beyond the road where it started. The legal record did not stay so clean. In 1947, at Dachau, Skorzeny himself was tried between August 18 and September 9th and acquitted. The court accepted a narrower distinction. Wearing enemy uniforms for infiltration and approach was not automatically enough on its own. The line turned on whether the men actually fought while still disguised. Change before firing, and the law saw one thing: shoot while still wearing the enemy's clothes, and it saw another. Same hedge, same road, same burst of gunfire from cover. A different uniform at the instant of attack changed the legal meaning. So the crucial detail from that Belgian roadside was also the smallest one. Not whether there was an ambush, not whether the mission was clever, not whether panic spread. It did. The deciding fact was whether the attack, if it came from soldiers hidden as soldiers, or soldiers hidden as the enemy. Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt were captured in U.S. uniforms, carrying those weapons 30 minutes after crossing the line. On December 23, 1944, they were shot at Henri-Chapelle. Number 13. The Gift That Kills. On December 12, 1944, in Jungersdorf, Germany, American troops entered a basement and found what looked like the most ordinary thing a retreat leaves behind: a dead soldier on the floor. Sergeant Dwight P. Ellett of the 3,908th Signal Service Battalion came in behind the 9th Infantry Division and photographed the scene for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. The body was German. The room had already been taken. Men still stopped at the doorway. Now the war no longer waits for a soldier to pull the trigger. Ellett's photograph is dated December 12, 1944, and tied to the advance of the 1st U.S. Army into Germany. The official caption says the corpse had been rigged as a booby trap with an explosive visible near the body. Not a man fighting, not a man surrendering. A body turned into bait. The image was marked confidential, censored for publication on December 15th, and cleared without restriction only on April 16, 1945. That delay matters. The picture showed more than a death. It showed a method that kept working after the firefight was over. Here the legal line begins to harden. Mines and traps were nothing new. Armies had used them in retreats, field defenses, roads, and approaches. The issue sharpened when the device was attached to something a person expects to touch without suspicion: a home, a cupboard, a medical item, a corpse. The target was no longer only the soldier rushing a bunker. It was whoever still treated the ordinary world as ordinary. In June 1943, the U.S. Military Intelligence Bulletin warned Allied troops in exactly those terms. Germans, it said, had booby-trapped doors, windows, steps, floors, pictures, furniture, and even bodies. Read that list slowly. A door is not cover. A window is not a firing point. A picture on a wall is not military equipment. These are the things that tell a soldier a building has been cleared and can become shelter, office, aid post, sleeping space. Once any of them may explode, capture becomes a job for engineers. That changed the work immediately. An advance party could not simply occupy what it had won. Every room had to be searched. Every drawer had to be opened like a grenade. Every abandoned vehicle had to be approached as if it were still manned. Every corpse had to be treated as a possible weapon. Some of these traps had clear tactical value. They slowed pursuit, delayed engineers, and forced units to spend time and men on clearance. Others served no tactical object whatever. That dry phrase means some devices existed mainly to punish whoever came next. The pattern reached far beyond one basement in Jungersdorf. In North Africa, British reporting from Agadir described a mined ring around the village stretching 3 to 5 miles from the center, with booby traps mixed into the defensive system. In Italy, the U.S. Army's engineer history records that more than 50 bulldozers struck mines during the campaign. Even the machines sent forward to make the ground safe were being hit. The burden spread outward. First, the infantry hesitates at the doorway. Then the engineers slow the column. Then the captured town stays unusable for hours or days because a staircase, a stove, or a body may still be part of the retreat. This tactic sits uneasily beside the others. Earlier dangers came from deceit during contact, the false surrender, the enemy uniform, the hidden shot. Here, contact is over. The street is taken. The firing has moved on. A soldier steps inside because walls, tables, drawers, and dead men belong to the aftermath. The trap reaches into that aftermath and strips it away. The sources are frustrating on one point. They document the devices in detail, but rarely say who gave the order in a specific case. Were trapped buildings and bodies part of organized German withdrawal doctrine in every instance, or local improvisations by retreating troops? In Jungersdorf, the chain of command behind that one corpse is still mostly missing. For the men entering the room, it made no difference. They still had to clear the building as if every object had intentions. Back in the basement, the detail that matters is small. Elliot's caption says there was an explosive visible close to the body. The charge is not the whole horror. The dead soldier had been made to guard something. Picture the room, cold floor. The fight outside has already moved on. A German body lies near the wall. Beside it sits a small object no one dares touch. It is not wired to the corpse. It is wired to the doorway. Number 12. Leaving nothing. Fifth is the tactic that wins time by burning the future. On March 3, 1943, Soviet troops entered Rzhev, 130 miles west of Moscow. They found a city that had not simply been abandoned, it had been processed. Streets were cut open, bridges were gone, wells were ruined. Houses had been stripped and burned in sequence before the last German units pulled back. This was the end of Operation Buffalo, the March 1st to 22nd evacuation of the Rzhev salient. Walter Model's 9th Army shortened the German front by about 230 miles and pulled out roughly 300,000 men, 100 tanks, and 400 artillery pieces. In a narrow military sense, it looked efficient. The line was shorter, the troops were saved, the retreat worked. What matters is what they left behind. Once armies withdraw, scorched earth can start to sound ordinary. Destroy the bridge so pursuit slows. Rip up the rail line so supplies stall. Blow the fuel dump so the enemy cannot use it. That is the familiar defense of the tactic. Ugly, but lawful if it serves retreat and immediate military need. The key is not destruction by itself. Armies in the Second World War did that everywhere, including the Soviets during the German invasion. The key is what was destroyed, for whom, and how far beyond the battlefield the order reached. Was this military necessity in the strict legal sense, or a crime wrapped in military language? The law had an answer. Article 23G of the 1907 Hague Regulations forbade the destruction or seizure of enemy property unless it was imperatively demanded by military necessity. not useful, not convenient, not vindictive, imperatively demanded. That is a narrow gate. The Rzhev zone, the evidence starts pressing against it very quickly. When British correspondent Alexander Worth later inspected the liberated area, he did not see random wreckage. He saw a pattern. Rzhev had 500 of 5,400 buildings still standing. Vyazma had 51 of 5,500. Zhatsk had 300 of 1,600. Those numbers do not look like a town caught in crossfire. They look like an inventory after removal. And it was not only buildings. About 15,000 people were deported from Rzhev, Vyazma, and Zhatsk alone. That shifts the meaning of the tactic. A blown bridge can be justified if it delays tanks. Taking able-bodied civilians west for labor is much harder to justify, especially when the elderly, the sick, and mothers with infants are left behind in a landscape where houses, grain, rail lines, mines, and wells have been wrecked. At that point, the retreat is no longer acting only on roads and depots. It is acting on survival itself. The battlefield has moved into kitchens, barns, water sources, and train stations. It reaches for the people who will still be there after the soldiers are gone. By late 1943, the wording of the orders became much less ambiguous. On September 7, 1943, Heinrich Himmler issued a scorched earth order for evacuated areas in Ukraine. The command was explicit. Leave the Red Army no people, no livestock, no grain, no railways, no usable houses, no mines, no wells. Not just supplies, not just transport nodes, people, livestock, wells. If scorched earth is supposed to mean denial of military assets, this order says something else. It puts civilian existence on the target list. It does not mean every destroyed building during the German retreat came from one central command. The sources stay uneven on local initiative. Some demolitions were plainly tactical. Bridges were blown because bridges matter. Railways were torn up with rail plows because pursuit depends on rail. Mines were laid because rear guards need time. A retreating army has real military reasons to destroy some of what it leaves behind. But in the East, the pattern kept going beyond that frame. German destruction measures became organized procedures in 1943, named systems rather than battlefield impulses. Villages were prepared for demolition before the last units left. Wells were poisoned or wrecked. Settlements were erased. Civilians were treated as movable resources if useful, and as a burden to be abandoned if not. When commanders later pointed to necessity, the evidence beside them pointed elsewhere: ideological punishment, economic plunder, and refusal to leave even the minimum basis for life. This is where the comparison in this video sharpens. Some commanders became famous for ruthless efficiency. Others were prosecuted. On the map, both can look similar for a moment: a retreat, a demolition, a denied resource. But status is not the dividing line. Cleverness is not the dividing line either. The line appears when destruction stops tracking an immediate military obstacle and starts disciplining a population. A bridge can be a military target. A village well, after evacuation of the front, is something else. Was burning supplies in retreat a lawful necessity or a crime? At Rzhev, the answer is not in the fire alone. It is in what the fire was attached to. A unit destroys a rail junction to slow an advancing army, the law can recognize the claim. If the same retreat leaves behind no shelter, no food, no water, and no civilians except those too weak to move, the act has crossed out of battlefield denial and into wanton destruction. The evidence does not say all scorched earth is forbidden. It says the tactic becomes forbidden when military need turns into civilian punishment. By the time Soviet troops walked into the evacuated zones, that distinction was no longer theoretical. In Rzhev, most of the city was gone. In Ukraine, the order already said what was not supposed to remain. In the villages between those points, the retreat could be counted in absences: the cow, the grain, the roof, the bucket, the water at the bottom of the well. Number 11. The raised hands trap. Before the number appears, watch the hands. They are raised, empty. In this scene, they may be the most dangerous weapon of all. It is night on Guadalcanal, August 12, 1942. 5 days have passed since the Marines came ashore. West of their perimeter, the jungle is black, wet, and loud with insects. Somewhere near Cocumbona, a story moves through the lines. Hungry Japanese troops may be ready to give up. Colonel Frank B. Getke thinks the rumor is worth checking. He is the 1st Marine Division intelligence officer, not a reckless private chasing talk in the dark. After nightfall, he takes a 25-man patrol by boat toward the Matanikau River. The plan is to meet men who were supposed to come in rather than fight. If the signal appears, raised arms, a white cloth, an unarmed approach, the ritual is simple. Shooting stops. Men become prisoners. The rule exists so battle has at least one marked exit. But Getke's patrol misses the intended landing point and comes ashore on hostile ground. The reception they expected never appears. No line of starving soldiers. No negotiated surrender. Japanese fire breaks out in the dark. Movement stirs in the brush. Then night attacks press the beach. Getke is hit. The Marines try to hold where sand meets jungle, on a strip too narrow for safety and too exposed for escape. By morning, out of 25 men, only 3 get away by swimming or fighting their way out. The story stayed in Marine memory because it seemed to settle the matter at once. If a rumor of surrender could end like that, then every signal tied to surrender could hide a blade, a raised hand, a wounded body, a man lying still, a strip of white cloth. Once those signs become suspicious, the battlefield shifts in a way artillery cannot produce. This is the raised hands trap. Not because every Japanese surrender on Guadalcanal was fake, not even because historians can prove the Gutka patrol walked into a carefully scripted ruse. They cannot, at least not cleanly. Some later accounts suggest the captured naval raiding may not have deliberately baited the Marines at all. The patrol may have been destroyed by bad navigation, weak security, and another fact that mattered just as much. The enemy position west of the perimeter was not preparing to capitulate. But for the men who heard the story afterward, nuance never stood a chance. Doctrine reinforced the lesson. U.S. intelligence manuals later warned that Japanese troops had used white flags of truce to close distance for combat. They also warned that apparently dead or wounded soldiers might wait until medics leaned in, then pull hand grenades from their clothing. Picture the distance shrinking. 10 yards. 5 yards. Arms reach. The law tells you to pause when an enemy genuinely surrenders. Perfidy works by turning that pause into an opening. Under the 1907 Hague Regulations, Article 23 forbade treacherous killing and the improper use of a flag of truce. That matters here because this is not just deception. Armies deceive constantly. Camouflage is deception. A feint is deception. An ambush is deception. This exploits the enemy's obligation to show mercy. The damage spreads beyond the first victims. You can see it in procedure. A real prisoner can no longer just walk forward with hands up and expect the ritual to work. He may be ordered to strip, ordered to crawl, to approach one at a time, covered by rifles the whole way. The gesture still exists, but it no longer carries trust on its own. For the first time in this list, the tactic does not simply kill people. It contaminates the mechanism meant to stop the killing. The legal line is sharper than the tactical picture. Whether the Getke patrol itself was a deliberate false surrender trap remains disputed. False surrender as a real danger in the Pacific does not. It happened. Field warnings said it happened. Men adjusted because they believed it happened. Once that belief took hold, later surrender became harder, slower, and more lethal for everyone involved. You can measure that against the end of the war. On Okinawa, even in one of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific, 7,401 Japanese soldiers surrendered to 10th Army troops. Genuine surrender did happen. But it happened inside an atmosphere of extreme distrust, built by years of fighting in which helplessness itself could be staged. The rule survived, but barely. In practice, it grew much harsher than it looked on paper. Officially, the signal is simple: empty hands, a white flag, an enemy out of the fight. After nights like Guadalcanal, those same signs could draw fire instead of mercy. A fake surrender kills the men who believe it. Then it reaches further. It teaches everyone watching that the next surrender may also be a lie. Genuine prisoners pay for that lesson. Number 10. Enemy clothes. 3 men in U.S. uniform were apprehended this date near Awali. The file opens with that plain sentence: no flourish, no battlefield poetry. A place in Belgium. A date: December 18, 1944. A jeep moving through the Ardennes 2 days after Hitler opened the Battle of the Bulge. At a checkpoint, the first test can be shouted through the winter air: "Who are you?" The jeep slows. Sentries look at faces, papers, insignia. If the men inside are American, the uniform protects them. If they are Germans in American clothes, the same jacket and patches become evidence. The 7th case turns on that switch. Cloth meant to identify a soldier becomes proof against him. On December 16, 1944, Otto Skorzenny's Panzer Brigade 150 entered the Ardennes with orders built around captured American things. Captured U.S. jeeps, captured U.S. weapons, captured U.S. papers, captured U.S. uniforms. The plan was to slip through American lines, reach the Meuse, and seize bridges if possible. If the bridges could not be taken, the men were to jam the rear areas so badly that the Allied response slowed down. The larger armored part of the scheme clogged almost at once. It ran into the same frozen traffic that trapped so much of the German offensive. That left the small deception teams as the men who could still move. One of those groups was Einheit Stielau. It was planned as about 150 English-speaking Germans with 30 captured jeeps and enough American gear to pass at a glance. That phrase matters: at a glance. Camouflage usually hides a body from the enemy's eyes. This borrowed the enemy's legal face. A soldier did not merely look harder to see. Looked like someone the other side was supposed to trust. Near Awali, U.S. forces detained 3 of those disguised men: Günther Billing, Wilhelm Schmidt, and Manfred Pernas. They were not in German field gray. No white flag protected the moment. They were wearing the other side's identity inside the combat zone. The law already had words for that. Hague Convention 4, Article 23F, prohibited the improper use of enemy military insignia and uniforms. The hard word was improper. Did disguise used for movement count? Did combat count? Did intent count? At the roadblock, no sentry was parsing treaty language. The question was immediate and practical. Is this jeep friendly traffic, or is the jeep itself a weapon? Interrogations followed, and the effect spread far beyond 3 prisoners. Captured memoranda and statements helped trigger a wave of roadblocks, password checks, and suspicion across Allied rear areas. Guards began testing Americanness with sports scores, state capitals, movie stars, geography, and slang. Senior officers were stopped. Men with the right patches, the right vehicles, and the right papers still found rifles pointed at them. A correct uniform no longer proved what it had proved the week before. The rumors moved faster than the actual operation. One intelligence scare warned that Skorzenny's men were hunting Eisenhower himself. Security tightened around Eisenhower. Paris area roadblocks multiplied. The panic dragged on until December 29th. The scale of the infiltration was small. Skorzenny later claimed 44 men had passed through American lines, with 8 not returning. The psychological effect was much larger than the unit. Battle that would cost the United States 19,276 dead and roughly 75,000 casualties overall. A handful of stolen uniforms helped jam trust in the rear almost as effectively as armor jammed roads at the front. Panic did not settle the legal question. A U.S. military commission moved quickly. On December 21, 1944, Billing, Schmidt, and Pernas were tried. The charge was not that they had carried American equipment in a truck bed. The charge was that they had entered the combat zone in American uniform as part of a hostile mission. In the testimony that survived, the issue stayed concrete. had they crossed the line from ruse to unlawful use of the enemy's status. An ambush deceives the eyes. This deception struck at the system armies use to recognize categories in war: soldier or spy, prisoner or infiltrator, medic or target. If the uniform could not be trusted even at a checkpoint, then recognition itself became unstable. The commission convicted all three. 2 days later, on December 23rd, they were executed by firing squad. The December verdict did not end the rule. After the war, the same operation produced a different result. From August 18th to September 9th, 1947, Skorzeny and 9 other officers from Panzer Brigade 150 were tried in Germany. The case grew out of the same broad operation, the same captured American uniforms, and the same war. With time to question witnesses and argue the line more carefully, the court treated the issue differently. Testimony complicated the rule. The court drew a distinction between wearing enemy uniforms for movement or deception before combat and actually fighting while disguised. For that line, disguise alone was not automatically enough for conviction. The prosecution could not establish unlawful use in the way it needed to. Skorzeny and the others were acquitted. The record now held 2 answers. In December 1944, under battlefield pressure, in the middle of a surprise offensive, after interrogations had detonated a security crisis, the Americans treated Billing, Schmidt, and Pernas as unlawful infiltrators. In the post-war trial, with lawyers, witnesses, and distance from the roadblocks, the court drew a narrower line between infiltration and firing. The 3 men taken near Iwala did not live long enough to stand inside that distinction. Billing, Schmidt, and Pernas were shot on December 23, 1944. Number 9. The War Starter. On the night of August 31, 1939, a man was left on the floor of a radio station to prove that a war had already begun. He was dressed to look like an attacker. He was dead before the attack he was supposed to authenticate. By morning, artillery, tanks, and official speeches would treat that body as evidence. The place was Gliwice, a German border city in Upper Silesia, today Gliwice in Poland. The tower still stands there, a wooden structure almost 111 meters high. It rises over the flat, dark ground around it. But the crucial object that night was not the tower, and not even the transmitter. It was the scene itself. A border incident had to look real. Germany was preparing to invade Poland on September 1, 1939, but it wanted a story first. Not aggression, defense. Not the opening blow, but the answer. SS officer Alfred Helmut Naujoks waited for orders from above. In his later sworn Nuremberg affidavit, he said the order came from Reinhard Heydrich. He said Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller handled the details no soldier could admit to in daylight. On the evening of August 31st, Naujoks led a small SD team to Sender Gliwice. They forced their way in. They reached the microphone. They broadcast a brief message meant to sound like Polish insurgents taking German territory. The exact wording is still murky because so much of the reconstruction runs through Naujoks's post-war account. The purpose is not murky at all. The station did not need to be held. It needed to be planted in the mind. A disguise at a checkpoint gets men through a line. This operation was built to push millions across one. It was not about surviving combat. It was about manufacturing the legal and political weather in which combat could begin. The tactic here did not hide a soldier. It disguised the beginning of a war. Gliwice was not a lone improvisation. It sat inside Operation Himmler, a chain of staged incidents along the frontier designed to portray Germany as the victim of Polish aggression. That mattered because one fake clash can be dismissed as confusion, but a pattern can be sold as a campaign. Multiple sparks make the fire look accidental. By the time German forces crossed the border the next morning, the public script was already in place. The script moved fast. Around 4:47 a.m. on September 1, 1939, the German attack on Poland was underway. The shelling of Westerplatte by the battleship Schleswig-Holstein marked one of its opening blows. Soon after, Hitler addressed the Reichstag and claimed Germany was responding, not initiating. He used the language of return fire, not conquest, not invasion, return fire. The provocation had done its job. It had converted preparation into pretext. The detail that locks the whole mechanism into place is the corpse. The Gestapo had a term for bodies prepared for these scenes: canned goods, in Naujoks's affidavit. Human evidence, arranged in advance. The dead man at Gliwice was Franciszek Honiok, a Polish-minded Upper Silesian farmer. Local museum material in Gliwice identifies him as the victim used in the provocation. He was not killed in a firefight. He was selected because his identity could help the fiction. Polish enough to fit the scene, civilian enough to disappear into the machinery. The body was left behind, so the fake seizure of the station would have something: a camera, a policeman, or a superior officer could point to and say, "There, proof." Slow the scene down. You are inside a radio building at night. There has been a burst of noise. A forced message goes into a microphone. Men move quickly through rooms built for wires and sound. Then they leave behind the one object that cannot answer back. Not a weapon, not a flag. A body. In the opening move of the European War, one of the most valuable props was a murdered civilian arranged to look like military evidence. There are still limits to what can be reconstructed with confidence inside the station. Historians argue over the exact wording of the broadcast, the exact sequence, even how many details can be verified independently of Naujoks. None of that uncertainty rescues the event. The broad structure is solid. Orders from the SS chain, a staged border provocation, a corpse supplied to make it credible, and invasion the next morning. So the identity withheld at the start of the scene is not some unknown saboteur pulled from the shadows. It is Franciszek Honiok, used after death as proof of an attack that had to exist before dawn. When Hitler spoke on September 1st, claiming Germany had been fired upon since the night before, the body on the floor at Gliwice had already been assigned its final role: exhibit for a lie. Since 5:45, we have been returning the fire. Number 8. The protected sign. Ninth is the tactic that turns the one symbol meant to remove weapons from the scene into a weapon itself. On January 15, 1945, in the Belgian hamlet of Henjeles, men from 3rd Platoon, Company G, 329th Infantry saw a German ambulance rush through a road junction near the front. A red cross was painted on its side. For a split second, that mark should have settled everything: do not fire. Instead, it forced the worst kind of hesitation. Fire at a real ambulance, and you are shooting at protected medical transport. Hold your fire on a fake one, and armed men slip through behind the one sign meant to prevent that choice from ever arising. As the vehicle entered the village, the symbol on its body was more than paint. It was a legal promise moving at speed. The post-war trial record says the Americans saw the ambulance first. Then shots came from inside it as it passed through Henjeles. A U.S. soldier fired a bazooka round in reply. The vehicle stopped. 2 German soldiers jumped out. One was killed. The other was captured alive. His name was Heinz Hagendorf. For a moment, the whole case turns on what no one could know at first glance. Was this an ambulance carrying wounded men and firing back in panic? Was it an empty medical vehicle being used as a shield for movement? Or had the emblem itself been turned into a combat trick? The answer decides everything. Either the painted cross still protects the men inside, or it becomes evidence against them. That may sound technical until you remember what the emblem is for. Under the Geneva framework, the Red Cross marked medical personnel, vehicles, and facilities. Its power depended on instant recognition. See the mark. Hold your fire. Let the wounded pass. It only works if the mark means the same thing every time it appears. The moment it covers shooting, ammunition, or troop movement, every stretcher, aid post, and ambulance behind it becomes harder to trust. This is different from ordinary deception. A false flag poisons one encounter. Misusing a medical sign corrodes the rescue system itself. The next driver carrying real casualties reaches a checkpoint under suspicion he did not create. The next medic may still be protected in law, but law does not decide whether a nervous rifleman trusts the paint. The law before and after the war tried to define that line with precision. Article 23F of the 1907 Hague Regulations forbade improper use of the distinctive signs of the Geneva Convention. The 1929 Geneva Convention, especially Articles 7 and 8, protected medical formations and transports, but only as long as they were not used for acts harmful to the enemy. There was a narrow exception for armed self-defense. A medic could carry a weapon. Guards could protect the wounded. That was not the same as driving a marked vehicle into a combat zone and firing from inside it. What happened to Hagendorf after Henjeles matters, because a court had to separate panic from abuse. On August 8th and 9th, 1946, at Dachau, a United States military court convicted him of wrongfully using the Red Cross emblem in a combat zone and sentenced him to 6 months in prison. Not years, 6 months. That sounds light beside other war crimes cases, but the judgment was exact. The court did not simply say the rules had been broken, treated the conduct as unlawful belligerency, while stressing that not every Geneva Convention violation automatically became a war crime. The court was answering the same question a soldier at that crossroads had to answer in seconds. When does protection end? Not because bullets are nearby, not because the front is chaotic. It ends when the protected sign is used to help the fight instead of removing people from it. The war produced enough blurred cases to show why that line had to be drawn hard. On November 7, 1941, the Soviet hospital ship Armenia was sunk in the Black Sea. All but 8 of roughly 7,000 people on board died. The case is cited because it shows how confusion multiplies when a marked medical vessel also carries military cargo or weapons. Once protection and military use share the same hull, the symbol is still visible, but its meaning is no longer clean. That practical danger haunted post-war Red Cross commentary. An ambulance returning empty toward the front was not just a neutral vehicle going back for casualties. It created temptation. If it still wore the emblem, it could move ammunition, messages, or armed men under a shield enemy troops were trained to respect. Later law tried to stop the sign from lingering on vehicles once they were no longer functioning as medical transport. So back at the crossroads in Henjeles, the key question was simple. What was inside? The record answers by implication. Not wounded men under medical care, because the protection failed for a legal reason, not a tragic one. American witnesses said shots were fired from the marked vehicle as it passed through the village. One bazooka hit stopped it. German soldiers came out. One died there. Hagendorf did not step out of an ambulance. He stepped out of evidence. Number 7. No prisoners for commandos. On October 18, 1942, a typed order left Hitler's headquarters and moved outward through the German chain of command. It did not describe a firefight, a confused surrender, or a split-second mistake at the edge of panic. It described what would happen after the shooting stopped. Men who should have become prisoners were being reassigned by paperwork. This tactic was not improvised in panic. It arrived as paperwork. The wording was blunt enough to survive translation without losing its violence. Allied commandos in Europe and Africa were to be killed, even if captured in uniform, even if they tried to surrender. The order used language about their annihilation and, in later testimony, slaughter to the last man. If such men were picked up away from open battle, they were not to enter the prisoner of war system at all. They were to be handed to the SD. The line running through this whole story is simple. It is not whether a tactic is daring or effective. It is whether it destroys the protections that make mercy possible once a fight is over. A month earlier, that order did not yet exist on paper. The men who would fall under its logic already did. Between 11 and 21 September 1942, Operation Musketoon sent 12 raiders into occupied Norway. 2 officers, 8 men from No. 2 Commando, and 2 Norwegian SOE operatives. Their target was the power plant at Glomfjord. A small team moved through a huge landscape to break something precise. The raid succeeded. The party split. 4 men made it across the border into Sweden. 1 died of wounds. The second group was hunted down. Crucial detail is plain. Captured raiders in uniform, taken alive, belonged in the oldest and clearest category in war: prisoners. Captain Graham Delamere Black was 31 years old, born on May 9, 1911 in Dresden, Ontario. Captain Joseph Blundell Johnson Houghton was also 31. Both survived the raid itself. Both were in German hands. In a lawful version of this story, capture would have ended the killing. It did not. The 7 captured men were sent to Germany, interrogated, and held outside the normal protection owed to prisoners of war. On October 23, 1942, 5 days after Hitler issued the commando order, they were shot at Sachsenhausen. Black was killed there. Johnson Houghton was killed there. The timing matters. Operation Musketoon began before the order was signed. Then the order gave the system a language for what men in custody could be made to disappear into. The tempo changes here. Once a state writes murder into instruction, the issue is no longer what one soldier did. It is what an institution decided. Later discussions inside the German command show that clearly. Alfred Jodl argued that the order should apply behind corps command posts, not in the beachhead battle area. Listen to what that means. Not objection. Calibration. Not whether captured commandos should be protected, but where legal murder should begin. You can feel the bureaucracy trying to solve a moral problem as if it were a map problem. Front line here, rear area there. If seized on the beach, perhaps one rule. If caught after breaking inland, another. But the victim at the center of it does not change. He is still a uniformed soldier who has been captured. Still someone the laws of war say must not be executed for being too effective at his job. Earlier in war, prisoners were murdered in rage, revenge, fear, collapse. Here, the machinery is colder. A top-secret order travels downward. Local commanders receive it. Security organs wait at the end of the process. The record fragments because some victims were shot by Wehrmacht units, others were passed to the SD or SS, and paperwork was concealed, scattered, or never meant to survive. We still cannot state with confidence how many Allied commandos were ultimately killed under the order across every theater. The number blurs. The principle does not. After the war, prosecutors pulled the order back into daylight and treated it as evidence, not rumor. In the case against Generaloberst Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, British prosecutors used the commando order to show that these killings were not battlefield improvisations by isolated men. They were command responsibility. A chain of command weapon. A signature became a death sentence hundreds of miles away. Go back to those raiders from Musketoon. Picture the category they should have entered: captured, disarmed, alive, protected. Then picture the category waiting for them instead, already forming above their heads before some of them were even shot. Officially, the German state could still speak the language of military necessity, special operations, unlawful raiders, exceptional danger. In reality, the men taken after Glomfjord were not processed as dangerous prisoners. They were processed as prisoners who had already been condemned. An official order dressed up as law. Number 6. Punishing the map. On October 20, 1941, Baron von Bischofshausen sent a warning into the schools of Kragujevac. Attendance was not optional. Principals had already been told on October 1st and again on October 17th that absent pupils and absent parents could be treated as saboteurs. So the classrooms stayed full. Boys took their seats. Teachers opened lessons. Outside, German occupation forces were closing the city. The first cold detail is not the shooting. It is the list. When the roundup began, names did not come from an investigation that traced a rifle to a hand. They came from institutions prepared in advance: schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, barracks yards. The method is visible before the bodies are. The trigger came a few days earlier, near the Kragujevac-Gornji Milanovac road. Fighting there left 10 German soldiers dead and 26 wounded. General Franz Böhm had already supplied the arithmetic for what would follow: 100 civilians for every German killed, 50 for every German wounded. No jury, no inquiry into who fired, just a ratio, 10 dead, 26 wounded. The totals started spreading across a map. The official story breaks down here. A commander can still claim danger when bullets are coming from a hedgerow or a cellar, but there was no battlefield position to suppress here, no artillery nest to silence, no column under immediate attack. There was an occupied city, turned into a quota. On October 18th, German forces had already seized male Jews and suspected communists. On October 20th, they tightened the ring. Peasants were still allowed to enter Kragujevac, so they could be trapped inside it too. Then soldiers entered the schools during class. They took professors, they took pupils from the 5th class upward. They marched them to the barracks yard, searched them, removed watches and small valuables, and locked them in overnight without food or water. A teacher stood beside his students. A boy old enough for 5th class was pushed into the same line. A father who showed up because absence had been threatened could be taken too. None of them had to be accused of the roadside attack. They only had to be there when the count was made. The next move reached people who had not been present when the trigger was pulled. By 1907, the Hague regulations had already tried to place a barrier here. Article 50 prohibited general penalties against a population for the acts of individuals, unless collective responsibility could actually be shown. But occupation authorities kept using the language of reprisals. Reprisals sounded procedural. They made it seem as if law were still in the room. In practice, fixed killing ratios stripped that away. If resistance appeared anywhere, punishment could be taken somewhere else. At 7 a.m. on October 21st, the executions began. Groups of 60 to 120 were marched out and machine-gunned. The shooting continued until about 2 p.m. 7 hours. Modern named research identifies 2,792 victims in Kragujevac. Around 270 were children. The youngest listed was 11 years old. Kragujevac was not an isolated spasm. The logic traveled. In Lidice on June 9th and 10th, 1942, after the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, about 500 residents were assembled and 173 men and boys were shot. The village was presented as if guilt had been established, but the link was flimsy, possibly false, and the destruction was turned into propaganda. In Rome, at the Ardeatine Caves on March 24, 1944, the formula changed, but the structure did not. 10 Italians for every German soldier killed, after the Via Rasella attack. The final total was 335 shot. That pattern matters for the larger question running through this whole video. Why do some wartime methods get defended as ruthless military necessity, while others end with men in the dock? This is where status stops helping. The victims in Kragujevac were not enemy soldiers caught fighting out of uniform. They were not prisoners accused of escape. They were hostages, students, teachers, townsmen, Jews, suspected opponents, and men gathered because they happened to be inside the cordon when the arithmetic came due. Post-war trials treated hostage shootings and collective punishment as major occupation crimes. The Nuremberg hostage case rejected fixed reprisal ratios as lawful practice, but Kragujevac had already shown what these operations were. Not security sweeps that got out of hand, not emergency fire breaks against guerrilla war. A timetable, a sealed city, full classrooms, a barracks yard, then the fields. The missing piece from the opening is the ugliest one. Those names were often not chosen because investigators found individual guilt. They were chosen because the occupier needed bodies from the nearest reachable pool. In Kragujevac, the answer to who died was often not who fired. It was who was in school, who was in town, and which place lay closest to the road where 10 Germans were killed and 26 wounded. Number 5. Hunger as a weapon. 12th is the tactic where the weapon is not fired. It is withheld. 125 grams, less than half a pound. In Leningrad, that was not a statistic. It was a day. On September 8, 1941, German forces took Schlisselburg on Lake Ladoga and closed the last land route into Leningrad. The ring shut around a city of millions. That same day, air raids hit food depots. The siege stopped being only about artillery, rail lines, and front sectors. It became a calculation in calories. Start with the duration. 872 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944. Long enough for an operation to become an environment. Long enough for hunger to stop feeling like an emergency and start functioning as policy. A bombardment kills in bursts. A starvation siege kills by subtraction. Bread reduced, fuel reduced, water harder to reach, transport weaker, bodies thinner, graves more frequent. Now the bombing. On September 19, 1941, the Luftwaffe dropped about 2,500 high-explosive and incendiary bombs on the city. Explosives kill fast. Fire in a besieged city does something else. It erases reserves. Warehouses burn once, the absence lasts all winter. The key date is September 29, 1941. A German naval staff record noted Hitler's decision that Leningrad was to be eliminated, not fed, not occupied, and not accepted even if it surrendered. That is the hinge. Siege warfare had a long military history. Cities were surrounded, shelled, and starved into submission. This went past capture. If surrender is refused, the civilians inside are no longer incidental to the pressure. They become the pressure. That matters for the question running through this video. Why does one commander become a hard man of war while another ends up associated with something forbidden? Method alone is never enough. Encirclement by itself is one thing. Encirclement paired with a decision not to feed, not to accept surrender, and not to assume responsibility for the people trapped inside becomes something darker. Inside that ring was Tanya Savicheva, 11 years old, living with her family on Vasilyevsky Island. By late November and into December 1941, children and dependents were down to 125 grams of bread a day. Hold that number for a moment. Look at what surrounded it. Power failed. Water systems failed. Winter temperatures fell deep below freezing. People pulled sleds through the streets, not with supplies, but with bodies. Death became domestic. It happened in apartments, on stairwells, in bread lines, in unheated rooms where the last useful object to burn had already gone into the stove. Tanya's notebook is one of the clearest forensic records of what starvation does when it is turned into a military instrument. Not a long diary, not reflection, a list. Her sister Zhenya died on December 28, 1941. Her grandmother on January 25, 1942. Her brother in March. 2 uncles in April and May. Her mother on May 13th. The entries grow shorter as the family shrinks. No massacre pit was needed to show intent. There was a kitchen table, ration cards, and a child writing down the order in which her home disappeared. The death toll usually given is over 1 million civilians from hunger, cold, bombardment, and disease. That number is so large it can blur, so narrow the frame. You are in an apartment in January. The windows are iced from the inside. The pipes are dead. The bread in your hand is dark, dense, and cut to a weight the state can still measure. Outside, a city that once moved by tram and factory whistle now moves by foot and sled. No shot has to be fired in that room. The attack has already arrived. There is another number buried inside the blockade. At the Vavilov Institute, scientists guarded seed collections, rice, grain, peas, plant material that was technically edible, while some of them starved to death beside it. They did not consume the collection because it represented future harvests, future survival beyond the siege. In a starving city, they died protecting food that was not allowed to become food. The pressure reached into the future and tried to eat that too. After the war, law moved toward naming this more clearly. In 1977, Additional Protocol 1, Article 54, explicitly prohibited starving civilians as a method of warfare. The rule came later, but Leningrad shows why it had to be stated plainly. The issue was never only that people inside a besieged city went hungry. Hunger itself had been shaped, maintained, and used. So go back to the number at the start, 125 grams. In ordinary life, it is a slice, a ration, a small piece of bread. In Leningrad, at the worst point of the winter of 1941, it became the measure of a city's engineered survival limit. The goal was no longer to take the city. It was to let mathematics do the killing. The hardest image is also the quietest. An 11-year-old girl with a pencil, turning a notebook into a family grave. Number 4. No warning at sea. On September 12, 1942, northeast of Ascension Island, Kapitän-Leutnant Werner Hartenstein fired on a British troop ship called RMS Laconia. It looked like a legitimate target, a large enemy transport in the South Atlantic, black water, wartime blackout, no safe way to ask questions first. Then the ship rolled. Lifeboats hit the sea. From the water, the men on U-156 heard something they did not expect. Italian voices, prisoners of war, civilians. Why did the submarine not surface, stop the ship, and warn everyone aboard the way the law seemed to require? Hold that for a minute. This case begins with a rescue, not a killing. The answer sits below the surface, where warning a target can cost a submarine its own life. On November 6, 1936, the London Submarine Protocol tried to force an old rule onto a new machine. A submarine was not supposed to sink a merchant vessel without first placing passengers, crew, and ship's papers in safety, except if the ship refused to stop or actively resisted. The rule sounds clean. Surface, search, warn, save. A submarine on the surface, though, is no longer hidden. It is a thin steel hull with a deck gun, limited speed, and very little room for mercy once aircraft, escorts, and radio reports enter the picture. That gap between law and combat shaped the whole subject. Unrestricted submarine warfare is often framed as simple savagery by choice, with prize rules sitting there as a realistic alternative. The record is uglier than that. In the Atlantic, German U-boats hunted inside convoy systems built to kill them. Merchant ships could be armed. Wireless sets could call destroyers. A warning shot could become a death sentence for the boat that fired it. Commanders increasingly skipped the ritual and fired first. Scale hardened that habit. Between 1939 and 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic cost the Allies around 3,500 merchant ships, 14.5 million gross tons, and roughly 72,200 seamen. Numbers that large stop feeling human. But each sinking began with the same compressed calculation. Surface and follow the rule, or stay hidden and survive. Then Laconia punched through that logic. Hartenstein had torpedoed a military target, but the sea around him filled with British personnel, civilians, Polish guards, and Italian prisoners. He did something that sounds almost impossible in this war. He began rescue work. U-156 hauled survivors aboard, towed lifeboats, and broadcast openly that he would not attack any ship assisting the rescue. Other Axis submarines joined in. For a moment, the Atlantic moved by a rule older than strategy. On September 16th, that pause ended. A USB-24 from Ascension Island found U-156 on the surface, packed with survivors and towing boats. The crew reported what they saw. They were ordered to attack anyway. The rescue collapsed. Men already pulled from the water were thrown back into it. A scene that could have shown submarines still acting lawfully taught the opposite lesson. On September 17, 1942, Karl Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order. U-boats were not to rescue shipwrecked crews except in narrowly useful cases, like capturing a master or chief engineer. The order did not create ruthlessness in the Atlantic. It made it official. That matters to the larger question running through this video, because the line here is harder to see. The tactic is brutal. The pressure behind it is mechanical. Radio, aircraft, convoy escort, the lethal penalty for surfacing. If that were the whole story, Nuremberg would have been simple. It was not. Within hours of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, sent a blunt order to the U.S. Navy. Execute against Japan unrestricted air and submarine warfare. Not after years of drift, not after every legal alternative had been drained. On the first day. In the Pacific, the United States adopted the mirror image of the practice it would later put on trial in Europe. The Pacific campaign was massive. U.S. submariners were only about 2% of the Navy, but they were credited with sinking roughly 55% of Japanese merchant ships lost, and 54.6% of all Japanese naval and merchant tonnage destroyed by U.S. forces. They paid for it too. 52 submarines lost, 3,628 submariners dead. These boats were not hunting under prize rule conditions. They were strangling an empire's shipping system. Go back to the opening scene. Why did the submarine not simply surface and warn the ship? By World War II, that legal script had collided with radar, aircraft range, armed merchants, convoy escorts, and one basic fact every submarine commander understood. Reveal yourself to save the target, and you may lose the boat before you save anyone. Laconia proved it in the cruelest way. The rare attempt at mercy became evidence against mercy. At Nuremberg, Dönitz used that collision as part of his defense. Still convicted on major counts, but on October 1, 1946, the judgment pointedly did not assess his sentence for breaches of the submarine warfare rules because Britain and the United States had used comparable methods. Officially, the 1936 rule still existed. In practice, both sides had already fought past it. Number 3. The city as target. On the night of July 27, 1943, a woman in Hamburg could run from one street to the next and still not outrun the same fire. In about 3 hours, flames swallowed 13.1 square kilometers. Air in the streets superheated. People were pulled toward the center of the burn as if the city had become its own weather. Roughly 30,000 died that night alone. Hamburg had been chosen for a reason: tonnage, density, and what packed neighborhoods could do once enough incendiaries landed close together. First, though, look at what those numbers did. Start with blindness. On July 24, 1943, the RAF opened Operation Gomorrah against Hamburg. Over the next 10 days, from July 24 to August 3, British and American raids dropped about 8,500 tons of explosives and firebombs on the city. Bombs alone do not explain why the defenses failed so completely. Chaff did part of the work. Radar screens filled with false echoes. Guns could still fire. Crews could still move. But the city was being hit while partly blinded. Then manpower. 14,000 firefighters, 12,000 soldiers, 8,000 technical troops. Even with numbers like that, the firestorm outran the response. The clue is structural. Not one bomb, not one squadron, a system. High explosives first, to open buildings and rupture water mains. Incendiaries after, to seed thousands of separate fires. Then enough concentration that those fires stopped being separate. The tactic was not simply to damage a factory inside a city. It was to make the city carry the attack forward. By February 14, 1942, that shift had already been written down. RAF's area bombing directive pushed attacks toward civilian urban areas with the stated aim of breaking morale. Industrial targets still existed. So did transport targets, dockyards, and rail links. But read the map that way, and homes, workshops, side streets, labor districts, and factory blocks stop sitting in neat legal boxes. They fuse. That is what makes this heavier than the cases before it. The method under the lens is not a secret order from the losing side. It is part of how the eventual victors fought. 14th is the tactic everyone could see from miles away, and almost no one wanted judged too closely afterward. Hamburg makes Dresden look less like an exception and more like a pattern. Between 13 and 15 February 1945, more than 1,000 British and American heavy bombers hit the city. Dresden was crowded with refugees by then. The American formations were formally assigned, at least at first, to rail yards and transport links. That matters. So does what happened next. Fires restarted and spread across the city center. About 1,300 tons of bombs fell. The official historian commission later fixed the death toll at about 25,000. On the briefing paper, the aiming point was transport. On the ground, the burn pattern spread through the city center. That tension never went away. The archives support both readings at once. Dresden was a transport hub moving troops and materiel east and west. Dresden was also a densely built urban center where explosive and incendiary bombing could not stay neatly confined to tracks and yards once the fires took hold. The same raid can be described in the language of rail disruption and in the language of terror. Both descriptions have evidence behind them. The argument survived the war because the record does too. Then the Pacific strips away even the old European architecture of brick and stone. On the night of 9th to 10th March 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay sent Mission Number 40 over Tokyo. 325 B-29s, low altitude, incendiaries. The mission report records 1,665 tons dropped. The official Japanese figures recorded 83,793 dead, more than 40,000 injured, and over 1 million left homeless. 16 square miles burned. In Hamburg, the city became a furnace. In Tokyo, huge districts of a wooden metropolis became fuel. That returns to the logic held back at the start. Why that city? Why those districts? Why governments could defend this and later sit in judgment over other wartime methods? Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial cities, transport systems, and urban areas in Germany and Japan. In places like Hamburg and Tokyo, industry did not sit apart from civilian life behind a clean perimeter. Workshops, workers, rail links, warehouses, power, housing, and narrow residential blocks were pressed together so tightly that the target package and the population map became almost the same document. World War II law had not yet developed the later precision language of distinction and proportionality in the form now expected, so prosecution after 1945 was politically and legally fraught. The fires were still real. Accountability was simply harder to separate from victory. A commander could say factory, rail yard, dockland, arsenal. The bomb pattern could answer with apartment blocks, shelters, schools, and bodies in the street. So the city was never only background. The mechanism. Buildings fed the heat. Density fed the spread. The people trapped inside were not collateral to the tactic. They were inside its design, even when the target folder used other words. By morning, what remained was often the quietest image in the war. Blocks still standing at the edges, ash in the center, and a row of chimneys rising from a city targeted as if industry and civilians were no longer separable at all. Number 2. The Laboratory Front. On August 13, 2024, a 94-year-old man stood in the Pingfang district of Harbin and apologized at the ruins of a place he had entered as a teenager. Hideo Shimizu had been sent there in March 1945. When Japan collapsed 5 months later, he did not describe liberation. He described cleanup. On August 12, 1945, he said he went into a special prison to collect human bones that had not fully burned. This tactic needed no front line. It needed a locked room and a clipboard. Years earlier, the Imperial Japanese Army had built Unit 731 under Shiro Ishii as a secret biological warfare center in occupied China. By 1925, the Geneva Protocol had already outlawed bacteriological methods of warfare. Unit 731 was organized to do exactly that under laboratory procedure: infect prisoners, test weapons on living bodies, and turn disease into a military instrument. Before asking how many died, start with the mechanism. In that sealed facility, what kind of weapon was being built? The paper trail answers in pieces. In 2018, Japan's National Archives disclosed a Unit 731 personnel list dated January 1, 1945, with 3,607 names. Not a rumor, not one doctor operating at the edge of empire, a staffed institution. In the United States, the National Archives later identified a Unit 731 and biological warfare set inside a larger declassified war crimes corpus of roughly 1,400 documents and 8 million pages. The filing scale says enough. It was not hidden because it was small. It was hidden because it was systematic. Then the locked room opens onto entire cities. On October 27, 1940, Chinese diplomatic reporting said Japanese planes dropped wheat grains over Ningbo. Plague followed. The outbreak lasted 34 days and 99 victims were reported. A year later, on November 4, 1941, another Japanese plane dropped rice, paper, and cotton wads over Chengde. Later, 9 plague cases were reported there. The numbers sound neat. Disease is not. It does not stay where a bombardier drew the circle. What made this method different from shells or fire was delivery. Unit 731 did not treat plague as an abstract pathogen in a flask. It treated insects as weapons platforms. Plague-infected fleas were part of the mechanism. Entomology became logistics. Grain, cloth, and paper were not random debris falling from aircraft. They were carriers, bait, and bedding for infection. The tactic moved through habits so ordinary they barely register. Sweeping a courtyard, picking up scattered food, shaking out fabric, standing where something landed. There is no blast to run from. The attack looks like litter in your street. The laboratory did not stop at disease release. Testimony and historical research tie Unit 731 to infection experiments, vivisection, frostbite testing, and weapons trials on prisoners. The usual vocabulary starts to soften the scene. Experiment sounds clinical. Research sounds distant. The procedure was physical. It required a human body that could be cut, infected, observed, and discarded under control. The facility tested bombs and bacteria. It also tested time. How long fever rises, how tissue dies, how a body fails under cold, how infection spreads from one stage to the next. The prisoner was not beside the weapon. The prisoner was inside it. In 1944, Ishii's program pushed further toward culturing agricultural pests to attack crops and deepen famine. The target widened from lungs and blood to harvests and kitchens. This was not a method built only to kill enemy soldiers efficiently. It pushed into harm that survives surrender. Civilians breathe it. Prisoners are used to perfect it. Food systems carry it onward. After Japan's surrender, even the record of the crime became part of the operation. Shimizu's memory of August 12 and 14, 1945, is not a story of witnesses walking freely into daylight. It is a retreat. Personnel burning bodies, personnel destroying evidence before fleeing China. The final images are administrative. Orders, furnaces, bones that did not burn cleanly enough. Some of the men connected to this program did not face full prosecution at all. The Khabarovsk trial in the Soviet Union, held from December 25 to 31, 1949, prosecuted 12 captured Japanese biological warfare personnel. Elsewhere, accountability fractured because the data had value. That fracture is why the death toll still resists a final number. Wartime documents give local counts for places like Ningbo and Chengde. Later historians argue that secondary outbreaks, cascading infections, and destroyed records make precision impossible. In Harbin, the sealed facility tested disease. It also used the human body as part of the weapon. Even the evidence was burned. Number 1. No way out. Last comes the tactic that makes every white flag, every raised hand, and every prison camp depend on whether the enemy still believes in rules. On October 18, 1907, the Hague Regulations put the line into a sentence. It was forbidden to declare that no quarter will be given. Cold legal words, almost bloodless. They were trying to protect one of the most fragile moments in war, the second when a man stops being a threat and becomes a prisoner. On June 6, 1941, 2 weeks before the invasion of the Soviet Union, the German Armed Forces High Command wrote a different kind of document. The Commissar order told German troops to separate captured Soviet political officers from the rest of the prisoners and shoot them. Not in the chaos of a firefight, not because they were still armed. After capture. The prisoner is already disarmed. He is under guard. He has entered the one space where violence is supposed to pause. For a moment, the whole system hangs on a thin belief. Surrender still protects the man who has surrendered. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, and the Eastern Front turned that belief into a mass grave. Soviet captives were taken in numbers so large they stopped looking like individuals to the machine holding them. About 5.7 million Soviet army personnel fell into German hands during the war. By the end, roughly 3.3 million were dead. By February 1942, only months into the invasion, 2 million of the 3.3 million Soviet soldiers captured up to that point had already died from starvation, exposure, disease, or shooting. In October 1941 alone, almost 5,000 Soviet POWs died each day in German custody. Set that number inside a day. Dawn. Count the living, march the column, leave the collapsed, close the gates, repeat tomorrow. This was no longer battlefield rage. Rage burns hot and passes. This was administration. Prisoners became a supply problem, a security problem, a racial problem, an ideological problem. Anything except protected men. Once an army learns that habit, it carries it forward. On December 17, 1944, at the Bonnier Crossroads near Malmedy, Belgium, Joachim Peiper's armored spearhead from the 1st SS Panzer Division overran Americans from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The German advance was racing through the Ardennes. The weather was freezing. The road was crowded with vehicles, prisoners, and momentum. Corporal Ted Palak later remembered being searched and herded into a field with other captured Americans. Around 113 prisoners had been taken there. Many were artillery observers. Their battle was already over. They stood under guard in the snow. Then German tanks and half-tracks opened fire. Paluk dropped and played dead. Around him, wounded men moved, groaned, tried not to move. SS men came through the field and finished the living. When it was over, 84 American POWs lay dead near the crossroads. The massacre was brutal. It was also imperfect. The killers did not seal the field completely. They did not kill every witness. Survivors escaped, reached American lines, and carried the story almost immediately. That mattered. Prisoner murder depends on silence. A dead prisoner cannot testify. A field of dead prisoners with survivors nearby becomes evidence. After Malmedy, the hard part was not proving that prisoners had been killed. The bodies were there. Survivors spoke. The unresolved part was the chain of intent. Was this the execution of a direct pre-offensive policy from Hitler or Peiper to kill prisoners, or a local decision by Peiper's subordinates in a fast-moving battle? The trial could punish the crime. The exact path from command culture to trigger pull remained contested. On May 16, 1946, the Malmedy trial began at the former Dachau concentration camp. 74 SS men were tried. On July 16, the tribunal found all defendants guilty. 43 received death sentences. 23 received life sentences. Others received shorter prison terms. And by 1956, every convicted Malmedy defendant had been freed. That does not erase the verdict. It sharpens the contrast. The law had been clear since 1907. The post-war court said prisoners could not be gathered, guarded, and shot. In the field, the rule lived or died inside the armed man standing over someone who no longer had a weapon. The contradiction separates cleanly. Speed could make a commander famous. Surprise could make a tactic legendary. Even ruthless efficiency could be admired if it struck a military enemy still fighting. Prisoner murder never became brilliance. A tactic becomes forbidden when it attacks surrender, prisoners, civilians, protected symbols, or the basic possibility of mercy. Officially, the white flag was protected by law. At Bonnier, it was only cloth until the men with guns decided what it meant. The rule promised every prisoner a way out. No quarter warfare was the decision to close it.